Respect begins with clarity, and the truth is simple. People cannot respect what they cannot understand. When your identity is uncertain, your values undefined, and your standards constantly shifting, you send a message whether you intend to or not. That message says you are still negotiating with yourself. And when you are negotiating with yourself, the world will negotiate with you too. Research consistently shows that individuals who communicate clear expectations and boundaries are significantly more likely to be perceived as competent and trustworthy in both professional and social environments, with some studies suggesting up to a 40% increase in perceived leadership credibility. This isn't because they are louder or more aggressive, it's because they are aligned. Their words match their actions, their decisions reflect their priorities, and that alignment creates something rare, certainty. Clarity is not about having all the answers, it's about knowing your direction. It's about understanding what matters to you and what doesn't, and having the discipline to act accordingly. Most people avoid this level of clarity because it requires confrontation with fear, with doubt, with the possibility of rejection. It's easier to stay vague, to adapt constantly, to become whatever the moment demands. But that flexibility comes at a cost. When you try to be everything, you end up being nothing in particular. Think about the people you naturally respect. They are not always the most talented or the most charismatic, but they are clear. You know where they stand, you know what they tolerate and what they don't. There is no confusion in their presence. And because of that, there is no need to test them. Clarity removes ambiguity, and ambiguity is where disrespect grows. When you lack clarity, you over-explain, you seek validation, you hesitate in your decisions. And people pick up on that instantly, not consciously perhaps, but instinctively. They sense the uncertainty and they respond to it. They interrupt you more. They challenge you more. They take more liberties, not because they intend to disrespect you, but because you haven't made your position clear enough to prevent it. Clarity changes that dynamic completely. When you are clear, your communication becomes concise. You don't need to convince, you simply state. You don't need to chase, you attract. You don't need to defend every choice, you stand by it. And in doing so, you create an environment where respect is the default, not the exception. But clarity is not just external, it begins internally. It requires you to define your principles before the world tests them. What do you stand for when it's inconvenient? What do you refuse to compromise on even when there is pressure? These are not questions you answer in the moment. These are decisions you make in advance. Because when the moment comes, you won't rise to the occasion. You will fall to your level of preparation. There is also a quiet confidence that comes with clarity. It doesn't need to be announced or displayed. It's felt. It shows in the way you carry yourself, in the way you respond rather than react, in the way you remain steady when others are uncertain. And that steadiness becomes a signal. It tells people that you are not easily influenced, not easily shaken, and not easily ignored. Clarity also protects your energy. When you know what aligns with you, you stop wasting time on what doesn't. You say no without guilt. You walk away without explanation. You invest your attention where it matters most. And that selectiveness increases your value because you are no longer available to everything and everyone. In the end, respect is not something you demand, it's something you make inevitable. And clarity is how you make it. Inevitable silence is a position of power, and most people underestimate it because they confuse it with weakness. In a world where everyone is competing to be heard, the one who chooses not to speak immediately stands out. Not because they are absent, but because they are deliberate. Silence, when used with intention, is not emptiness. It is control. Studies in communication psychology suggest that people who pause before responding are perceived as more thoughtful, more authoritative, and more confident, with measurable increases in how credible their opinions are received. This happens because silence signals processing. It tells others that you are not reacting, you are deciding, and that distinction changes everything. Most people speak to fill space. They rush to respond, to justify, to explain. But in doing so, they give away their position. They reveal uncertainty, emotion, and sometimes insecurity. Silence does the opposite. It creates space for observation. It allows you to read the room, to understand intent, to gather information that others are too busy talking to notice. And information in any interaction is leverage. When you choose silence, you shift the dynamic. The other person begins to wonder what you're thinking. They lean in, they talk more, and often they reveal more than they intended. Silence invites disclosure. It creates a subtle pressure that compels others to fill the gap. And in that moment, you gain clarity without giving anything away. Silence also demonstrates emotional control. Anyone can react instantly. Anyone can raise their voice, defend their point, or push back without thinking. But it takes discipline to hold your response, to sit in the tension without rushing to resolve it. That discipline signals strength. It shows that you are not controlled by the moment, you control how you show up in it. There is also a precision that comes from silence. When you don't speak constantly, your words carry more weight. People listen more closely because they know you don't waste language. Each sentence becomes intentional, each statement becomes impactful. And over time, your voice becomes something people pay attention to, not something they tune out. Silence protects you from unnecessary conflict. Not every comment deserves a response. Not every challenge requires engagement. When you respond to everything, you lower your position to the level of every situation. But when you choose silence, you elevate yourself above trivial exchanges. You show that your energy is selective, and that selectiveness commands respect. It also gives you time. Time to think. Time to choose the right words. Time to decide whether a response is even necessary. And often in that space, you realize that saying nothing is the strongest move you can make. Because once words are spoken, they cannot be taken back. But silence keeps your options open. There is a misconception that silence means you have nothing to say. In reality, it often means you have too much to say, and you are choosing not to say it carelessly. It is restraint, it is awareness, it is confidence in knowing that you don't need to prove your intelligence or your value in every moment. Silence also shifts how people perceive your presence. When you are constantly speaking, you blend into the noise, but when you are selective, you become noticeable. People begin to anticipate your input. They assign value to your perspective before you even share it, and that anticipation is a form of respect. But silence must be intentional. Passive silence, driven by fear or hesitation, does not command respect. It must come from choice, not avoidance. The difference is felt. One shrinks your presence, the other amplifies it. One is uncertainty, the other is control. In the end, silence is not about saying less for the sake of it. It's about saying only what matters when it matters. And when you master that, you don't need to demand attention. Your presence creates it. Boundaries define your value, whether you state them clearly or allow others to discover them through how you tolerate behavior. Every interaction you have is teaching people how to treat you, not through what you say once, but through what you consistently allow. And when there are no clear boundaries, there is no clear value. Research in workplace psychology and behavioral studies suggests that individuals who set and enforce clear personal and professional boundaries are significantly more respected by peers and leaders, with some findings indicating up to a 50% increase in perceived reliability, authority, and leadership presence. This isn't because they are rigid or difficult. It's because they are predictable. People know where the line is, and more importantly, they know that line will not move under pressure. Most people struggle with boundaries because they associate them with conflict. They fear that saying no will lead to rejection, tension, or disapproval. So instead, they say yes when they mean no. They overcommit, overextend, and overexplain. And in the process, they slowly erode their own sense of self. Because every time you ignore your own limits to please others, you send a message, not just to them, but to yourself, that your needs are negotiable. Boundaries are not about controlling others, they are about controlling access to you. Your time, your energy, your attention, these are limited resources. And anything that is limited has value, but when you make yourself constantly available, when you accept every request, when you tolerate every behavior, you remove that scarcity. And without scarcity, there is no perceived worth. Think about the people you respect the most. They are not the ones who agree with everything or accommodate everyone. They are the ones who stand firm, the ones who can say no without apology, the ones who don't need to explain their standards because their behavior already communicates them. There is a quiet strength in that consistency. It signals that they are not easily influenced, not easily pressured, and not easily taken for granted. When boundaries are weak, people test them. Not always intentionally, but naturally. They interrupt more. They ask for more. They expect more. And each time you allow it, the line moves further away from you, until eventually you feel overwhelmed, undervalued, and resentful. Not because people are inherently disrespectful, but because the boundaries were never clearly defined in the first place. Setting boundaries requires clarity and courage. Clarity to understand what you will and will not accept, and courage to enforce it even when it's uncomfortable. Because there will be moments when people push back. There will be moments when saying no feels difficult. But those moments are the test. And every time you hold your boundary, you reinforce your value. Boundaries also eliminate confusion. When people know your limits, they adjust their behavior accordingly. They don't have to guess. They don't have to test. And that clarity creates smoother, more respectful interactions. Because respect thrives in environments where expectations are clear and consistent, there is also a level of self-respect that comes with strong boundaries. It's the understanding that your time matters, your energy matters, your peace matters, and that understanding changes how you show up. You become more selective, more intentional, more focused. You stop trying to please everyone and start prioritizing what aligns with you. Importantly, boundaries do not require aggression. They do not require long explanations or emotional reactions. In fact, the strongest boundaries are often the simplest: a calm no, a quiet refusal, a decision followed by consistent action, no drama, no justification, just certainty. Over time, people begin to recognize this pattern. They see that you are consistent, that you don't bend under pressure, that your standards are not temporary, they are part of who you are. And that recognition turns into respect. Not because you demanded it, but because you demonstrated it through your behavior. In the end, boundaries are not something you set once. They are something you live daily. And through them, you show the world exactly how much you value your self-emotional control signal's strength. Not because emotions are weak, but because mastery over them is rare. Anyone can react. Anyone can raise their voice, defend their ego, or let frustration take over in the heat of the moment. But the ability to stay composed, to choose your response instead of being driven by impulse, is what separates presence from chaos. And people recognize that difference immediately. Research in behavioral psychology and leadership studies shows that individuals who regulate their emotional responses effectively are perceived as significantly more competent, trustworthy, and authoritative, with some findings suggesting up to a 60% increase in leadership credibility and decision-making confidence. This is not about suppressing emotions. It is about directing them. It is about understanding what you feel without allowing it to dictate what you do. Most people operate on reaction. Something happens and they respond instantly. There's no pause, no filter, no awareness. But reaction is predictable. And predictability makes you easy to influence. When others know what triggers you, they can control the interaction. They can push your buttons, shift your state, and lead you into decisions you might not otherwise make. Emotional control removes that leverage. It creates distance between stimulus and response. And in that space, you gain power. Control does not mean silence or passivity. It means precision. It means choosing when to speak, how to speak, and whether speaking is even necessary. It means recognizing when anger is rising, but deciding not to express it impulsively. It means feeling pressure, but not letting it distort your judgment. This level of awareness requires discipline. It requires practice. But once developed, it becomes a defining trait of your presence. People test emotional stability, often without realizing it. They challenge ideas, question decisions, and sometimes provoke reactions, not always with negative intent, but as a way to understand boundaries and strength. When you react emotionally, you confirm instability. But when you remain calm, when you respond with clarity instead of intensity, the testing stops. Because there is nothing to gain from pushing someone who cannot be shaken. There is also a clarity that comes with emotional control. When you are not overwhelmed by immediate reactions, you can see situations more objectively. You can assess what is actually happening instead of what it feels like is happening. And that distinction leads to better decisions. Decisions that are not driven by ego, fear, or temporary emotion, but by long-term perspective and purpose. Emotional control also protects your reputation. A single moment of uncontrolled reaction can undo years of credibility. Words spoken in anger, actions taken in frustration, decisions made under pressure. These are the moments that define how others see you, not your intentions, but your behavior under stress. When you maintain control in those moments, you build trust. You show consistency, and consistency builds respect. There is a quiet confidence in someone who does not need to react to everything. It shows that they are not seeking validation. They are not trying to prove themselves in every interaction. They are grounded, secure, focused. And that presence influences the environment around them. It calms situations, stabilizes conversations, and creates a sense of certainty that others naturally respond to. Importantly, emotional control is not about ignoring what you feel. Emotions carry information. They signal what matters, what feels right or wrong, what requires attention. But information is only useful when it is processed, not when it is expressed without thought. Control allows you to interpret your emotions before acting on them. It turns reaction into response, and response into intention. Over time, this discipline becomes part of your identity. People begin to expect composure from you. They rely on your steadiness in difficult situations. They trust your judgment because it is not clouded by impulse. And that trust evolves into respect, not because you demanded it, but because you consistently demonstrated control when it mattered most. In the end, strength is not measured by how loudly you react, but by how well you remain in control when others cannot. Consistency builds authority, not through grand gestures, but through repeated proof. It is not what you do once that defines you. It is what you do over and over again when no one is watching, when it's inconvenient, when motivation fades. Authority is not claimed in a moment, it is earned in patterns, and people are always watching patterns. Behavioral research and performance studies consistently show that individuals who demonstrate reliable, repeatable actions are perceived as significantly more trustworthy and competent, with some findings indicating up to a 70% increase in perceived authority and long-term influence compared to those who rely on intensity alone. This happens because consistency reduces uncertainty. And where there is less uncertainty, there is more trust. Where there is more trust, there is more authority. Most people chase intensity. They wait for motivation, for the right move, for the perfect moment to act. And when it comes, they go all in. But intensity is temporary. It fades. It depends on emotion, and emotion is unstable. Consistency, on the other hand, is independent of how you feel. It is a decision, not a reaction. And that decision, repeated daily, becomes your identity. When you are consistent, your actions begin to speak louder than your words. You don't need to remind people of your value. They see it, they experience it, they rely on it. You become predictable in the best possible way, not boring, but dependable. And dependability is rare. In a world full of inconsistency, showing up the same way, with the same standards over time, becomes a powerful signal. Inconsistency creates doubt. One day you deliver, the next day you disappear. One moment you are focused, the next you are distracted. And that unpredictability makes it difficult for others to trust you fully. Not because they don't believe in your potential, but because they don't know which version of you will show up. Authority cannot exist where there is doubt. It requires stability. Consistency also builds internal strength. Every time you follow through on a commitment, especially when it's difficult, you reinforce discipline. You prove to yourself that your actions are not controlled by mood or circumstance, and that self-trust changes how you carry yourself. It creates confidence that is not based on outcomes, but on effort and reliability. There is also a compounding effect to consistency. Small actions repeated over time create results that are far greater than any single burst of effort. Progress becomes inevitable, growth becomes visible, and as results accumulate, so does your credibility. People begin to associate you with execution, not intention. And that association strengthens your authority. Consistency eliminates the need for constant explanation. You don't have to convince people of your commitment when they have seen it repeatedly. You don't have to defend your discipline when your actions demonstrate it daily. Your behavior becomes your reputation. And reputation, once established, speaks on your behalf even when you are not present. Importantly, consistency is not about perfection. It is about persistence. There will be moments when you fall short, when things don't go as planned. But consistency means you return, you adjust, you correct, and you continue. It is the ability to maintain direction even when progress is imperfect. And that resilience further strengthens how others perceive you. Over time, consistency creates a sense of authority that feels natural, not forced. People begin to look to you for guidance, not because you demand attention, but because you have demonstrated reliability. They trust your process. They respect your discipline. And they recognize that your results are not accidental. They are built. In the end, authority is not given to those who show up occasionally with brilliance. It is given to those who show up consistently with intention. Walking away is ultimate confidence, not because you lack strength to stay, but because you have the strength to choose yourself over what no longer aligns. Most people associate confidence with persistence, with holding on and proving a point. But real confidence is quieter. It is the ability to recognize when something is no longer serving you and having the discipline to leave without needing validation, closure, or approval. Psychological and behavioral studies on self-worth and decision-making suggest that individuals who can disengage from unproductive relationships, environments, or conflicts are perceived as significantly more self-assured and emotionally intelligent, with some findings indicating up to a 65% increase in perceived personal strength and independence. This is because walking away signals something powerful. It shows that your value is not dependent on the situation you are leaving. Most people stay too long. They stay in conversations that drain them, in relationships that diminish them, in environments that limit them. Not because they don't see the problem, but because they fear the consequence of leaving. They fear being misunderstood, judged, or alone. And in that fear, they compromise. They tolerate, they negotiate their own standards. But every time you stay where you should leave, you send a message that your boundaries are flexible when pressured. Walking away interrupts that pattern. It redefines your standards not through words, but through action. It tells others that access to you is not guaranteed, that your time, your energy, your presence must be earned and respected. And when that respect is absent, you do not argue, you remove yourself. That decision carries more weight than any explanation ever could. There is also a clarity that comes with walking away. When you remove yourself from noise, from conflict, from misalignment, you create space. Space to think, to reset, to realign with what actually matters. Staying often clouds judgment. It pulls you into cycles of reaction and emotion. But leaving breaks that cycle. It gives you perspective. And with perspective comes better decisions. Walking away is not avoidance. It is selection. It is choosing where your energy is best invested. Not every opportunity deserves your attention. Not every disagreement deserves your response. Not every person deserves continued access to you. And the ability to make those distinctions is a sign of maturity, not weakness. There is a misconception that walking away means losing. That if you leave, you are giving up or admitting defeat. But in reality, the opposite is true. Staying in a situation that compromises your values is the real loss. Walking away is reclaiming control. It is deciding that your standards are not negotiable. Even if it costs you something in the moment, it also demonstrates emotional independence. When you no longer rely on others for validation, approval, or closure, you become difficult to manipulate. People cannot use guilt, pressure, or expectation to influence your decisions, because your decisions are not based on external reactions. They are based on internal alignment. And that independence commands respect. Walking away requires courage. Not dramatic, visible courage, but quiet, internal strength. The strength to accept that not everything will resolve the way you hoped. The strength to let go of what is familiar in order to protect what is essential. And the strength to trust that leaving creates space for something better, even if you cannot see it immediately. Over time, people begin to recognize this pattern. They see that you do not stay where you are not valued, that you do not argue endlessly to be understood, that you do not chase what does not choose you, and that recognition changes how they approach you. They become more intentional, more respectful, more aware of your standards. In the end, walking away is not about distance, it is about direction. It is the decision to move toward what aligns instead of staying attached to what does not. And that decision, made consistently, becomes the clearest expression of confidence.